Hey everybody, I'm back in the garage again for another video. This time I'm going to be replacing my old garage door openers with brand new units. I couldn't find a manufacture date on the old ones, but I'm pretty sure they're original to the house in 1989, so the new ones will definitely be an upgrade, and I'll also be adding garage door sensors since the old ones don't have any. Real quick, I want to give a special thank you to my friends Will and Amanda, who gifted me both of these garage door units after they had their house built and decided to upgrade from what the builder put in. So thank you very much, guys, I really appreciate it. After pulling the cord to detach the door from the track, I started looking around at all the connection points to figure out how to remove the old track and unit. This bracket here is what connects to the arm that eventually leads up to the track. I loosened and removed the lock ring and then pried out the pin to release the arm. The next connection point is a bracket up on the wall above the door and also has a lock ring and a pin. I pulled out the lock ring, but I left the pin attached and then started unfastening the bolts at the motor. My goal here was to lower the unit down onto the ground while remaining connected to the wall up front, but as it turned out I didn't have enough clearance to avoid putting pressure on the spring, so I ended up lifting the unit back up into place and then detaching it from the front first before just lowering the entire unit to the ground. I was surprised at how heavy the old unit was, but the new unit is much lighter. To install it, I'm basically doing those exact same steps, but in reverse order. On my first attempt here, I realized that I threaded the bolts through the wrong openings on the motor, so I couldn't quite reach the bracket above the door. So I went ahead and fixed that. But it also turned out that the new motor wasn't going to match up with the old bracket, and I had to use the one that came with the new motor. I removed the old bracket and drilled some pilot holes set for the right spacing on the new bracket. And then I attached it to the wall with the same bolts. This time I was able to get everything matched up and secure it with the pin, and then lock it in place with the ring. The arm on the new motor isn't configured correctly, but it's comprised of several metal pieces that are bolted together, so I just unfastened the bolts and extended the arm before putting it back together. Wiring up the new unit was as simple as plugging in the colored wires to their matching colored receptacles. I then plugged the unit into power, and it was time for a test run. So the first test resulted in no movement of the door, so I double-checked that the track was engaged, but when I looked closer, this white piece of plastic inside the track is what grabs the arm that connects to the door as they try to slide past each other. Obviously the door is closed right now, so they're not connected, but since the piece of plastic is up top, hitting the button makes the motor think the door is trying to close, and since there are no sensors attached, the door won't move. I manually lifted the door just to let some more light in, and then I started installing the sensors by bolting them to the outside of the track. I was surprised that they didn't need any sort of calibration or anything. Just mounting them in place facing each other was enough to make them work. I ran into a slight problem on the other side of the door when one of the bolts broke in half, but thankfully I had a suitable replacement on hand. This is just one of those little problems that comes up during a project that you can't really plan for. I used a spool of 20 gauge wire to connect the sensors to the motor. I didn't use any exact measurements here and just unraveled the wire to be about the length of the entire garage. It turned out that this worked, but I might recommend that you do something a little more precise because one of the wires was almost too short to be used. And if you end up cutting one too short, you'd be wasting that section of wire. To wire up the sensors, you don't necessarily have to get into the attic. You could run the wires up the wall and then across the ceiling to the garage door unit, but I wanted to do it the quote-unquote right way and hide all the wiring inside the attic. I fed some 2x4s up into the attic space to span the joists and give me something to walk on, and it should be noted that I also shut the power off at the breaker. There shouldn't be any bare wire exposed in the attic, but I figured it was worth being extra cautious. I poked my head up into the attic just to get an idea of what was in store for me, and then climbed back down to get started on the wiring. I drilled a small hole above each of the sensors that goes straight up through the drywall ceiling and into the attic. I then fed a line of fish tape up through the hole and into the attic so it would stick out of the insulation and make it easy to find. I then climbed up into the attic with the 20 gauge wire and taped it onto the fish tape and then pulled the fish tape back down through the hole, pulling the wire through with it. And so it went for each of the 4 sensors, fishing the tape up through the hole, climbing up with the wire and attaching it to the tape, and then pulling it back down through the hole again. I fed the other end of the 20 gauge wire past the electrical box in the ceiling by the motors, and then wired them up to each of the units. The other end of the wire had to be stripped, and then each of the strands had to be attached to each of the terminals on the sensor. With both of the sensors wired up, I felt like it was now time to take another shot at lowering the door. So as you can see, everything's working now, but there's still a small gap at the bottom of the door. I read through the manual a bit, and it turns out that this is part of the programming for the new unit. You can manually program the bottom position and the top position, and from then on when you open and close the door, it will open and close to those limits. Once that was all set up, the only thing left to check was to make sure the sensors would stop the door from closing if some idiot were to stick his foot in the way. I went ahead and replaced the second garage door unit just like the first, but at the end I ran into a little problem. One of the steel cables attached to the door had unraveled and came off the spool, and before I was done fixing it, both ends had come off at different times. I figured out the best way to fix it was to lift the door up manually and put a clamp on the track to hold the door up. While it was held, I completely unraveled the steel cable and then carefully held it tight while I re-wrapped it around the spool. Once it was all the way wrapped around, I looped the end of it back on the knob on the door. As long as I kept it tight enough while winding it around the spool, it didn't have enough play to come off the spool again once it was reattached. With both of the doors functioning as expected, I put in some cable staples to help organize the sensor wires and hold them tight against the wall. I also used a little bit of spray foam in the holes where the sensor wire goes into the attic. These garage door units also came with 2 keypads, and I hung those outside each of the doors. These are a nice little quality of life thing to have. And with that, this project is complete.